The history of U.S. involvement in the Middle East stretches back more than a century, shaped by a complex interplay of political, economic, and strategic factors. From the early 20th century, the Middle East became a region of significant interest for the United States, primarily due to its rich oil reserves, which were essential for fueling the growing global industrial economy. The discovery of oil in countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Iraq made the region a focal point for U.S. foreign policy, even as the U.S. initially remained relatively neutral in the internal politics of Middle Eastern nations. In the post-World War II era, the United States became increasingly involved in the Middle East as the Cold War escalated. The U.S. sought to contain Soviet influence in the region, fearing that communist ideologies could gain a foothold in the strategically important and resource-rich countries. This resulted in a series of military and diplomatic interventions, including efforts to support pro-Western governments and alliances while undermining Soviet-backed regimes. One of the earliest examples of this interventionist approach occurred in Iran in 1953, when the CIA orchestrated a coup to overthrow the democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh had attempted to nationalize Iran's oil industry, a move that threatened British and American oil interests. The coup placed the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, in power, solidifying a strong U.S. ally in the region. But it also sowed the seeds of resentment among the Iranian population, which would later contribute to the 1979 Iranian Revolution and the rise of anti-American sentiment. Throughout the mid-20th century, U.S. policy toward the Middle East was guided by a strategic goal of ensuring the stability of the region in favor of American interests, often through military alliances and direct interventions. The U.S. supported various authoritarian regimes in the region, including those in Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Iraq, as a means of counteracting the perceived threat of communist expansion. These alliances were crucial in maintaining access to the region's oil resources, which were vital to U.S. economic interests and the global energy market. However, this policy of supporting authoritarian regimes created tensions within the Middle East and fostered an environment of political instability. Local populations often viewed the U.S. as complicit in the oppression of their governments, which led to the rise of extremist ideologies and movements, particularly in response to U.S. backing of Israel in its conflicts with neighboring Arab states. These tensions would come to a head in the late 20th century, particularly in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, both of which had profound implications for U.S. strategy in the region. The U.S. responded to the Iranian Revolution by supporting Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War, 1980 to 1988, hoping to prevent Iran from becoming a regional hegemon. At the same time, the U.S. provided covert support to Afghan Mujahideen fighters in their battle against the Soviet forces, viewing this as part of the broader Cold War struggle. These interventions, while successful in achieving short-term goals, contributed to the long-term destabilization of the region, creating a landscape ripe for further conflict. By the time the 1990s rolled around, the Middle East had become a central battleground in the global struggle between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. The U.S. maintained military bases and alliances throughout the region, projecting power to counter any challenges to its interests. The Gulf War of 1990 to 1991 marked a significant moment in U.S. military involvement, as Iraq's invasion of Kuwait threatened regional stability and the flow of oil. The U.S., alongside a coalition of allies, swiftly defeated Iraq's forces, but the war also left unresolved tensions that would later contribute to the Iraq War of 2003. As the 21st century dawned, U.S. involvement in the Middle East took a more aggressive turn, particularly after the events of September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks carried out by al-Qaeda shocked the world and changed the trajectory of U.S. foreign policy. The U.S. launched the War on Terror, beginning with the invasion of Afghanistan in 2001, followed by the controversial invasion of Iraq in 2003. These wars, rooted in the desire to eradicate terrorism and prevent weapons of mass destruction from falling into the hands of hostile states, would become defining moments in the history of U.S. intervention in the Middle East. The historical context of U.S. involvement in the Middle East is essential to understanding the reasons behind these military interventions. Over the decades, American foreign policy in the region has been shaped by a combination of economic interests, geopolitical strategies, and a desire to maintain control over global power dynamics. Yet, despite the long-standing U.S. presence in the region, the complexity of the Middle East, its historical conflicts, its diverse cultures, and its volatile politics, has made it difficult for the U.S. to achieve lasting stability and peace. The legacy of past interventions continues to influence U.S. decisions and strategies in the region today, as the lessons of history remain deeply relevant in shaping the future of American foreign policy. The Gulf War, also known as the Persian Gulf War, was a turning point in U.S. military involvement in the Middle East. It marked the first major military engagement for the United States in the region following the Cold War. The conflict emerged out of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990, a move that sent shockwaves through the Middle East and triggered a swift response from the international community, led by the United States. The invasion was the result of a complex mix of political, economic, and strategic factors that had been building for years, but the American reaction to Iraq's actions would ultimately define a new era of interventionist foreign policy in the Middle East. The Iraqi leader, Saddam Hussein, justified his invasion of Kuwait by claiming that Kuwait had overproduced oil, thereby driving down prices and hurting Iraq's already struggling economy. Hussein also accused Kuwait of slant drilling into Iraqi oil fields, effectively stealing Iraq's resources. Moreover, Iraq's military had suffered significant damage during the Iran-Iraq War, and Hussein sought to assert Iraq's dominance in the region by seizing Kuwait, a wealthy and strategically located nation. The invasion, however, was not only an act of aggression against a neighboring country, but it also posed a direct threat to the stability of the broader Gulf region, particularly due to Iraq's control of Kuwait's significant oil reserves and its proximity to Saudi Arabia, a key U.S. ally. In response to Iraq's invasion, the United States, under President George H.W. Bush, quickly mobilized a broad international coalition to confront the Iraqi threat. The U.S. had long been an ally of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and both nations were seen as crucial to American economic and strategic interests in the region. The U.S. feared that if Iraq succeeded in annexing Kuwait, it could lead to further destabilization and potentially allow Saddam Hussein to control a significant portion of the world's oil supply. The implications for global oil markets and U.S. energy security were too great to ignore. Additionally, the United States was concerned that Iraq's aggression might embolden other regional powers and spark broader conflict. The U.S.-led coalition included not only NATO allies such as the United Kingdom and France, but also Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Syria. The coalition's primary objectives were to remove Iraqi forces from Kuwait, restore Kuwait's sovereignty, and prevent Iraq from further destabilizing the region. The United Nations, UN, played a crucial role in the diplomatic efforts, passing a series of resolutions calling for Iraq's withdrawal from Kuwait and imposing sanctions. The U.S. also sought to establish a clear military objective: the liberation of Kuwait. The coalition's military response, known as Operation Desert Storm, was a textbook example of modern warfare. The air campaign, which began in January 1991, was one of the most intensive bombardments in military history, targeting Iraq's military infrastructure, communication systems, and command centers. The U.S. used advanced technologies such as precision-guided munitions, and its air superiority allowed it to incapacitate much of Iraq's military capability from the air. The ground campaign, which began in late February 1991, was swift and decisive. Coalition forces, which included a heavy presence of U.S. troops, swiftly advanced into Kuwait and southern Iraq, crushing the Iraqi forces and forcing their retreat. The Gulf War was heralded as a success for the United States and its allies. Within a matter of weeks, Kuwait was liberated, and Saddam Hussein's military was severely weakened. The speed and effectiveness of the operation were a testament to the power of the U.S. military and its ability to coordinate a multinational coalition. The war also showcased the technological advancements that had become a hallmark of U.S. military superiority, particularly in terms of air power and intelligence capabilities. However, while the Gulf War was a military triumph, its aftermath raised important questions and left lingering consequences that would affect U.S. policy in the region for years to come. Despite the coalition's military success, Saddam Hussein was not removed from power. The decision not to pursue regime change in Iraq, likely influenced by concerns about the stability of Iraq and the potential for sectarian violence, was controversial. Hussein remained in power, and the U.S. imposed a no-fly zone over northern and southern Iraq to contain his regime. This created a long-standing military presence in Iraq, which would continue to shape U.S. policy in the region. Moreover, the war did not lead to lasting peace in the Gulf. The U.S. maintained a military presence in Saudi Arabia and other parts of the region, which contributed to growing resentment among certain segments of the population, particularly in the Arab world. This resentment was one of the factors that would eventually fuel extremist movements, including the rise of al-Qaeda. The Gulf War and the subsequent U.S. presence in the Middle East became a rallying cry for groups opposed to American influence in the region. The Gulf War also marked a shift in the way the U.S. viewed military intervention in the Middle East. The success of the war demonstrated that the U.S. could exert its influence through military means, but it also highlighted the complexity of the region's geopolitics. The war's legacy would shape U.S. policy in the Middle East, particularly as Saddam Hussein's regime continued to defy international sanctions and resolutions, leading to the eventual invasion of Iraq in 2003. The Gulf War set the stage for a more proactive and interventionist U.S. approach to the region, but it also underscored the challenges and unintended consequences of military intervention in such a volatile and complex part of the world. The Gulf War, while a short-lived conflict, had far-reaching consequences that would echo throughout the next decades of American foreign policy in the Middle East. It not only marked a defining moment in U.S. military history, but also laid the groundwork for the broader and more complicated wars that would follow. The Iraq War, which began in 2003, was one of the most consequential and controversial conflicts in modern U.S. history. It was the culmination of nearly a decade of tension following the Gulf War, during which Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, remained a defiant force in the Middle East. The war's origins can be traced to the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, which reshaped U.S. foreign policy, leading to a greater emphasis on preventing the spread of weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and countering terrorism globally. The decision to invade Iraq was not solely about the immediate threat posed by Hussein, but was also influenced by broader geopolitical concerns, including the desire to reshape the Middle East and eliminate potential threats to U.S. interests. In the years following the Gulf War, Saddam Hussein's regime continued to defy United Nations, UN, sanctions and inspections, creating a tense international situation. Despite the failure to find any active weapons of mass destruction, the regime's refusal to comply with international weapons inspections raised suspicions in the United States and among its allies. Additionally, the U.S. government, under President George W. Bush, began to focus on Iraq's potential links to terrorist organizations, particularly al-Qaeda. The Bush administration argued that Hussein's regime could provide weapons of mass destruction to these groups, which could then be used against the U.S. and its allies. In the wake of the September 11th attacks, the U.S. embarked on a broader campaign known as the War on Terror, which involved military interventions in Afghanistan and later Iraq. The Bush administration's rhetoric, particularly in the 2002 State of the Union address, identified Iraq as a key part of the axis of evil, along with Iran and North Korea. The administration argued that Iraq, by not fully disarming, posed an imminent threat to global security. This narrative was bolstered by intelligence reports, many of which were later found to be misleading or exaggerated, particularly regarding Iraq's WMDs. In March 2003, the United States, with a coalition of forces including the United Kingdom, Australia, and Poland, launched a military invasion of Iraq, dubbed Operation Iraqi Freedom. The invasion was swift, utilizing the overwhelming firepower of the U.S. military, which quickly overran Iraqi defenses. Within weeks, U.S. forces had captured Baghdad, and Saddam Hussein's regime was toppled. Hussein himself was captured in December 2003 and later executed by the Iraqi government. The initial phase of the invasion was hailed as a military success, with the rapid fall of the Iraqi government seen as a sign of U.S. military supremacy. However, the aftermath of the invasion proved to be far more complicated and disastrous than many had anticipated. The power vacuum left by the collapse of Hussein's regime led to widespread sectarian violence, ethnic tensions, and the rise of insurgent groups. Iraq's infrastructure, already damaged by years of war and sanctions, was further devastated, and the lack of a coherent post-war reconstruction plan left the country vulnerable to chaos. The U.S. struggled to establish a stable government, as Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish factions vied for control, often with violent consequences. One of the most significant consequences of the Iraq War was the rise of insurgent and extremist groups, particularly Al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, which would later evolve into the Islamic State, ISIS. The U.S. invasion of Iraq created an environment of instability and lawlessness, which allowed these groups to flourish. AQI, led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, exploited the sectarian divisions within Iraq and used brutal tactics to further destabilize the country. As the insurgency grew, the U.S. found itself engaged in an increasingly complex and violent counterinsurgency operation, with American forces becoming embroiled in a bitter and prolonged conflict. The Iraq War also had significant political ramifications both domestically and internationally. In the U.S., the war became a deeply polarizing issue. The Bush administration faced widespread criticism for its handling of the invasion, particularly as the initial justification for the war, that Iraq possessed WMDs, was proven to be false. The failure to find any substantial evidence of WMDs led to accusations of dishonesty and manipulation of intelligence. Public opinion on the war soured, and the conflict became a major issue in the 2004 and 2006 elections, with growing calls for a withdrawal of U.S. forces. Internationally, the invasion of Iraq strained relations between the U.S. and many of its traditional allies. The U.S. acted without the explicit approval of the United Nations Security Council, and many countries, including France and Germany, opposed the invasion. The war contributed to a growing divide between the U.S. and Europe, as well as within the broader international community. The lack of a UN mandate for the invasion undermined the legitimacy of the U.S.-led coalition, and many critics argued that the war violated international law. As the war dragged on, it became increasingly clear that the U.S. had underestimated the challenges of rebuilding Iraq. The insurgency intensified, and violence escalated, particularly during the sectarian conflict that erupted between Iraq's Sunni and Shia populations. The U.S. military, despite its technological superiority, struggled to cope with the complexities of asymmetric warfare and the challenges of occupying a country with a deeply divided society. The Iraq War became a quagmire, with no clear end in sight, and by 2006, the situation in Iraq had worsened to the point that some analysts began to speak of the country as a failed state. The war had profound implications for U.S. military strategy, with the U.S. military becoming increasingly bogged down in the conflict. In 2007, President George W. Bush ordered a surge of additional U.S. troops to Iraq in an attempt to stabilize the country. The surge was partially successful in reducing violence, but it was clear that the U.S. was facing an insurmountable challenge in trying to rebuild a fractured nation. Meanwhile, the cost of the war, both in terms of human lives and financial resources, continued to rise. By the time U.S. forces officially withdrew from Iraq in 2011, more than 4,400 American soldiers had been killed, and tens of thousands had been wounded. The financial cost of the war was estimated to be over $2 trillion. Despite the U.S. withdrawal in 2011, the effects of the Iraq War continued to be felt for years. The power vacuum created by Hussein's fall led to the rise of ISIS, which seized control of large parts of Iraq and Syria, plunging the region into further chaos. The war also strained U.S. relations with its allies in the Middle East, particularly Iran, which was able to expand its influence in Iraq following the collapse of Hussein's regime. The Iraq War left an indelible mark on U.S. foreign policy, shaping the discourse around military intervention and the challenges of nation-building in the Middle East. The consequences of the war continue to resonate today, influencing U.S. actions in the region and its approach to conflicts like the Syrian civil war and the fight against ISIS. The War on Terror, a term coined by the Bush administration in the wake of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, was a sweeping and multifaceted global campaign that redefined U.S. foreign policy and military strategy for over 2 decades. The attacks, carried out by al-Qaeda, left nearly 3,000 people dead and marked a turning point in the United States' approach to security. The traumatic impact of 9/11, along with the scale of the destruction and the sense of vulnerability it left behind, prompted the U.S. to embark on a new, aggressive foreign policy aimed at eradicating terrorism and preventing future attacks. The initial focus of the war on terror was on al-Qaeda, the extremist network led by Osama bin Laden, which had claimed responsibility for the 9/11 attacks. U.S. President George W. Bush immediately declared a global war on terrorism, which would involve both military action and intelligence operations aimed at dismantling terrorist organizations and eliminating the conditions that allowed them to flourish. The war on terror would involve numerous countries, span multiple theaters of conflict, and redefine the relationship between the U.S. and much of the world, particularly the Middle East. The first major military operation under the War on Terror was the invasion of Afghanistan, which began in October 2001. The Taliban regime, which controlled Afghanistan, had provided a safe haven for al-Qaeda and allowed the group to operate freely within its borders. The U.S. demanded that the Taliban hand over bin Laden, but the Taliban refused. In response, the U.S. launched Operation Enduring Freedom, a combined air and ground assault aimed at dismantling the Taliban government and capturing or killing al-Qaeda operatives. The initial invasion was swift and successful, with U.S. forces in partnership with the Northern Alliance, an anti-Taliban Afghan group, ousting the Taliban from power within a matter of months. However, the victory in Afghanistan, while a significant military success, soon proved to be more complex than anticipated. The Taliban, though ousted from major cities, retreated to rural areas and mountainous regions, where they could regroup and continue to mount an insurgency against U.S. and NATO forces. The U.S. and its allies faced a protracted and difficult conflict, involving not only conventional warfare, but also counterinsurgency operations against a resilient and elusive enemy. The challenges of nation-building and establishing a stable, democratic government in Afghanistan were compounded by the rugged terrain, the complex ethnic and tribal divisions within the country, and the pervasive corruption that hampered efforts to rebuild. The war on terror expanded rapidly, both in scope and geographical reach. While Afghanistan was the immediate focus, the broader goal of dismantling terrorist organizations led the U.S. to focus on other parts of the Middle East, particularly Iraq. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, justified by claims that Saddam Hussein's regime had weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and was harboring terrorists, was a major part of the war on terror. The U.S. administration, with support from the United Kingdom and a small coalition of allies, argued that removing Hussein would not only eliminate a dangerous dictator, but also send a message to other regimes that might harbor or support terrorism. The Iraq War, however, diverted attention and resources away from Afghanistan, and the consequences of the invasion would have far-reaching effects. While the U.S. achieved a quick military victory by toppling Saddam Hussein, the absence of a clear post-war plan and the failure to anticipate the insurgency and sectarian violence that would follow plunged Iraq into chaos. The rise of groups like al-Qaeda in Iraq, IQI, and later the Islamic State, ISIS, showed how the U.S. invasion inadvertently fueled the very terrorism it sought to eliminate. Meanwhile, the war on terror also involved a significant expansion of the U.S. intelligence and surveillance apparatus. The U.S. government instituted a variety of measures aimed at preventing future terrorist attacks, many of which raised concerns about civil liberties and human rights. The most controversial of these measures was the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, and the implementation of the USA Patriot Act, which expanded the government's surveillance capabilities and allowed for increased monitoring of suspected terrorists and their associates. While these measures were intended to protect the U.S. from further attacks, they also sparked debates over the balance between national security and personal freedoms. One of the most enduring legacies of the war on terror was the use of enhanced interrogation techniques, often referred to as torture, in the interrogation of suspected terrorists. The CIA's secret detention facilities and the use of waterboarding and other methods sparked widespread condemnation, both domestically and internationally. Critics argued that these practices violated international law, damaged the U.S.'s moral standing and often yielded unreliable intelligence. Supporters of the tactics, however, argued that they were necessary to extract crucial information that could prevent future attacks. The global reach of the War on Terror led to military operations and counterterrorism efforts in a variety of countries, including Pakistan, Yemen, Libya, Somalia, and the broader African Sahel region. The U.S. engaged in drone strikes, special operations raids, and partnerships with local forces in an attempt to target terrorist leaders and disrupt terrorist networks. Drone strikes, in particular, became a controversial aspect of the War on Terror, with critics questioning the legality of extrajudicial killings and the collateral damage caused by strikes in civilian areas. Proponents, on the other hand, argued that drones provided an effective, low-risk means of eliminating terrorist leaders while minimizing the U.S. military's footprint in sensitive regions. The War on Terror also had profound effects on U.S. military strategy. The long-term nature of the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, combined with the difficulties of counterinsurgency warfare, led the U.S. military to rethink its approach to modern warfare. The U.S. began to focus more on irregular warfare, building partnerships with local forces, and conducting targeted strikes against specific individuals rather than large-scale, conventional military operations. The challenges faced in Iraq and Afghanistan led to a re-evaluation of the U.S. military's readiness for unconventional warfare, with an increased emphasis on training for counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations. The War on Terror has had a lasting impact on U.S. foreign policy, public perception, and global security. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, while initially framed as necessary responses to terrorism, became quagmires that undermined the goals of the War on Terror. The continued presence of U.S. forces in the Middle East, combined with the rise of new terrorist threats like ISIS, has made it clear that eradicating terrorism and stabilizing the region are far more complex than initially anticipated. The War on Terror has also sparked a re-evaluation of the use of military force in addressing non-state actors and has led to greater scrutiny of the effectiveness and ethical implications of such campaigns. The Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, has become one of the most complex and devastating conflicts of the 21st century, drawing in various international actors, including the United States, and exacerbating sectarian and geopolitical tensions in the Middle East. The origins of the war can be traced to the broader wave of protests and uprisings known as the Arab Spring, which spread across the Arab world starting in late 2010. What began as peaceful demonstrations against the authoritarian regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad quickly escalated into a full-scale civil war as the Assad regime responded with brutal force, killing and imprisoning thousands of protesters. The violence sparked a wider rebellion, with opposition groups emerging across the country, some advocating for a democratic government, while others were driven by radical ideologies. Syria, under Assad, had been an important player in the region with strong ties to Iran and Hezbollah, as well as a history of antagonism with the West, especially the United States. Assad's government, supported by the Russian Federation, cracked down harshly on opposition forces and the country's complex sectarian divisions, comprising mainly Alawite Shiite Muslims, Sunni Arabs, Kurds, and various Christian and Druze communities, meant that the conflict was not just political, but deeply rooted in religious and ethnic identities. As the conflict grew in scale, it became clear that the Syrian civil war would be anything but a quick resolution, as it evolved into a multifaceted and multi-sided war involving various regional and international powers. The United States initially responded to the Syrian civil war with condemnation of Assad's brutal tactics. In 2011, President Barack Obama called for Assad to step down, imposing sanctions on the Syrian government. However, the U.S. hesitated to become directly involved in military action in the early stages of the conflict, preferring diplomatic pressure and support for non-jihadist opposition groups. As the situation worsened, the U.S. began to funnel arms and support to certain factions of the Syrian opposition, hoping to build a coalition of moderate forces that could challenge Assad's regime. However, the absence of a clear, unified opposition and the increasing presence of Islamist militants, including the rise of groups such as al-Nusra Front and ISIS, complicated U.S. efforts. The turning point for U.S. involvement in Syria came in 2013, when reports emerged of a chemical weapons attack on civilians in the Damascus suburb of Ghouta, attributed to Assad's regime. The attack led to widespread international outrage and calls for intervention. The Obama administration, which had previously drawn a red line regarding the use of chemical weapons, faced intense pressure to respond. However, despite the rhetoric, Obama ultimately chose to pursue a diplomatic solution, working with Russia to broker an agreement under which Syria would agree to destroy its chemical weapons stockpiles, avoiding military strikes. This decision was controversial and left many questioning the credibility of U.S. deterrence against chemical weapons use. Despite the chemical weapons agreement, the situation in Syria continued to deteriorate. By 2014, ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, had emerged as a significant player in the region, seizing large parts of Syria and Iraq, including the strategic city of Raqqa, and declaring the establishment of a so-called caliphate. The rise of ISIS presented a new and more direct threat to the U.S. and its allies, and the Obama administration shifted its focus to combating this terrorist group. The U.S. launched a campaign of airstrikes and special forces operations, initially in Iraq, but later expanding to Syria in support of local Kurdish and Arab militias. The U.S. also established a broader coalition of Western and Arab partners to defeat ISIS, which culminated in the liberation of key cities, such as Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa in Syria, by 2017. The Syrian conflict also brought the U.S. into direct confrontation with Russia. Russia, a longtime ally of the Assad regime, intervened militarily in 2015 to prop up the Syrian government, conducting airstrikes against opposition forces and contributing to the recapture of critical areas by Syrian troops. The U.S. and Russia found themselves operating in the same airspace and often in direct conflict over their respective objectives in Syria. The U.S. led an air campaign against ISIS while Russia focused on supporting Assad's forces and combating other opposition factions. The U.S.-Russia rivalry in Syria raised the specter of a broader proxy war, and both sides frequently clashed diplomatically and militarily. The U.S. response to the Syrian conflict continued to evolve under President Donald Trump. Early in his administration, Trump was reluctant to become further entangled in Syria, and his policy focused primarily on defeating ISIS. However, in 2017, Trump authorized missile strikes against the Syrian government's airbase in response to another chemical weapons attack in the town of Khan Sheikhan. This marked a significant escalation of U.S. military involvement in Syria. Despite these strikes, Trump remained committed to withdrawing U.S. troops from Syria, a decision that led to significant controversy, especially among U.S. allies in the region, such as the Kurds, who had been key partners in the fight against ISIS. The U.S. withdrawal, announced in late 2018, created a power vacuum in northeastern Syria, allowing Turkey to launch an offensive against the Syrian Kurds, who were seen by Turkey as an extension of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, a Kurdish separatist group considered a terrorist organization by Turkey. The U.S. decision to withdraw, effectively abandoning the Kurdish fighters, sparked outrage both within the U.S. military and among international allies. The Kurds, who had been instrumental in the defeat of ISIS, felt betrayed by the U.S., and Turkey's actions further complicated the conflict, with fears of ethnic cleansing and further destabilization. By the end of 2019, the U.S. had significantly reduced its troop presence in Syria, but U.S. forces remained stationed in the country, particularly around oil fields in the east, as a means of preventing ISIS from regaining strength and to counterbalance Iran's growing influence in the region. Iran, which had been providing support to the Assad regime, continued to increase its presence in Syria, and the U.S. remained concerned about the potential for Iranian-backed forces to threaten Israel and disrupt regional stability. Throughout the conflict, the U.S. also had to grapple with the humanitarian crisis that Syria was facing. The war has led to hundreds of thousands of deaths, and millions of Syrians have been displaced, creating one of the largest refugee crises in modern history. The U.S. has provided significant humanitarian aid to the Syrian people, both within the country and to refugees in neighboring countries such as Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. However, the complexity of the war, coupled with the divided international response, has made it difficult to achieve a lasting peace. The Syrian civil war remains a key issue in U.S. foreign policy. While the defeat of ISIS marked a significant achievement, the war in Syria is far from over, and the U.S. faces ongoing challenges in navigating its interests in the region. The involvement of multiple international actors, the rise of new militias, and the shifting alliances in the region have made Syria a focal point for geopolitics in the Middle East, with U.S. foreign policy continuing to be shaped by both the immediate and long-term implications of the war. The rise of ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, represented one of the most significant and alarming developments in the Middle East and posed a direct challenge to U.S. interests, both regionally and globally. Emerging from the chaos of the Iraq War and the subsequent instability in Syria, ISIS quickly became one of the most formidable terrorist organizations in modern history, both in terms of territorial control and its brutal ideology. By the time it declared the establishment of a caliphate in 2014, ISIS had captured large swaths of territory in both Iraq and Syria, including major cities like Mosul and Raqqa. Its rise prompted the United States to reevaluate its approach to the region, leading to a shift in military, diplomatic, and counterterrorism strategies. The origins of ISIS can be traced back to al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, a group that had been formed in the early 2000s by the Jordanian militant Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. After Zarqawi's death in 2006, AQI continued to operate in the insurgent environment created by the Iraq War, and its leaders gradually shifted from al-Qaeda's broader ideology to a more radical and extreme vision for the future of the region. Following the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq in 2011, the group capitalized on the political vacuum, sectarian tensions, and the weakening of the central government in Baghdad to expand its influence. By 2013, the group rebranded itself as the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham, ISIS, and in 2014, it declared a caliphate under the leadership of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, an event that marked its transition from an insurgent group to a self-declared state with an unprecedented level of ambition. The sudden rise of ISIS posed an existential threat to both Iraq and Syria. The group's brutal tactics, ranging from mass executions to the enslavement of religious minorities, particularly Yazidis, shocked the international community. It was characterized by a relentless propaganda campaign, which attracted thousands of foreign fighters from around the world, many of whom were radicalized by ISIS's promises of a utopian Islamic caliphate. ISIS's success in establishing control over large areas of Iraq and Syria was due in part to the sectarian divides in the region, as Sunni Muslims in particular found the group's militant vision appealing in the context of years of discrimination by the Shia-majority governments in both Iraq and Syria. The United States initially responded to the rise of ISIS with airstrikes and intelligence sharing, focusing on assisting local forces, particularly Kurdish fighters, the Iraqi military, and Syrian opposition groups, who were directly fighting ISIS on the ground. President Barack Obama, who had initially focused U.S. efforts on reducing its military footprint in the Middle East, found himself in a difficult position as ISIS's territorial gains threatened both regional stability and global security. In 2014, the U.S. launched a formal military campaign known as Operation Inherent Resolve, aimed at degrading and ultimately defeating ISIS. This included a combination of airstrikes, special operations missions, and support for local ground forces, such as the Kurdish Peshmerga, the Syrian Democratic Forces, SDF, and Iraqi military units. The strategy of the U.S. and its allies was multi-pronged, conducting precision airstrikes to weaken ISIS's infrastructure, cutting off its financial resources, and aiding in the ground battles to recapture key cities from ISIS's control. The U.S. also sought to disrupt ISIS's online presence, targeting its sophisticated social media campaigns that were used to recruit fighters and spread its radical ideology. Despite these efforts, ISIS continued to expand its control in Iraq and Syria through 2015, capturing the city of Ramadi in Iraq and continuing to carry out high-profile attacks across the region, including the notorious attack on the French satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo in Paris in January 2015, and the deadly attacks in Brussels, Tunisia, and elsewhere. In response to the growing threat, the U.S. deepened its involvement in the region. By 2015, U.S. forces had deployed thousands of troops to Iraq and Syria, providing direct military support to local forces fighting ISIS. American forces were embedded with Iraqi and Kurdish fighters, conducting joint operations to retake key cities and regions from ISIS. The U.S. also provided significant air support to the Syrian Democratic Forces, which were primarily composed of Kurdish fighters and Arab militias, to dismantle ISIS's control in northern Syria, including the capture of ISIS's de facto capital, Raqqa, in 2017. This coalition strategy was instrumental in dislodging ISIS from its territorial holdings, but it was not without controversy. The U.S.'s support of Kurdish forces, particularly the YPG, People's Defense Units, in Syria, angered Turkey, which viewed the YPG as an extension of the PKK, Kurdistan Workers' Party, a Kurdish separatist group labeled as a terrorist organization by Turkey. One of the key challenges in combating ISIS was its decentralized structure. Although it operated in a manner similar to traditional state militaries, ISIS was also a networked, decentralized organization with fighters scattered across multiple countries. Its network extended beyond Iraq and Syria, with ISIS branches in Libya, Egypt, and parts of Africa and Asia, making it a global threat. The U.S. and its allies recognized that defeating ISIS militarily required not only crushing its territorial holdings, but also dismantling its ability to operate as a global terrorist network. This involved targeting ISIS's leadership, cutting off its funding streams, which included revenues from oil, extortion, and human trafficking, and conducting counterterrorism operations worldwide. In 2016, ISIS's leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, remained elusive despite efforts to capture or kill him. However, the U.S. was able to make significant progress in weakening ISIS's grip on the region. Major cities like Mosul, Iraq's second-largest city, were retaken by Iraqi forces with the assistance of U.S. airstrikes, marking a turning point in the battle against the terrorist group. In 2017, ISIS's territorial control was further diminished, and by 2019, ISIS had lost nearly all of its captured territory, including Raqqa and the final stronghold of Baghouz in eastern Syria. However, the defeat of ISIS on the battlefield did not signal the end of its influence. While ISIS no longer controlled significant swaths of territory, it remained a potent force for global terrorism. Its ability to inspire attacks worldwide, through both coordinated operations and lone wolf actors, ensured that its ideology would continue to pose a threat to global security. Despite losing territory, ISIS retained a significant network of supporters and cells across the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia, leading to concerns that the group could regenerate in the absence of a sustained counterterrorism effort. The U.S. and its allies continued their counterterrorism operations against ISIS, focusing on the remnants of the group and its ability to regroup in the desert and mountainous regions of Syria and Iraq. The U.S. also continued to engage in efforts to prevent ISIS from regaining control over any significant territory, while ensuring the region did not descend into further chaos that would allow other extremist groups to rise in ISIS's place. However, the broader implications of ISIS's rise and fall raised important questions about U.S. policy in the Middle East. The military campaigns against ISIS demonstrated the challenges of nation-building, counterinsurgency, and dealing with non-state actors, while the group's ability to adapt and survive as a decentralized entity suggested that the fight against global terrorism would require more than military interventions. The legacy of ISIS and the U.S. response to it also highlighted broader issues in U.S. foreign policy. Critics argued that the Iraq War and the broader war on terror had destabilized the region, creating conditions that allowed groups like ISIS to flourish in the first place. Moreover, the involvement of multiple actors, including regional powers like Iran and Turkey, further complicated the situation, showing that the Middle East remains a deeply fragmented and volatile region. The fight against ISIS has illustrated the limits of military power in achieving long-term stability and has underscored the need for a more comprehensive approach that includes political solutions, economic development, and regional cooperation to prevent the rise of new extremist groups. The period between 2017 and 2021 saw significant shifts in U.S. policy toward the Middle East, marked by both a desire to reduce American military presence in the region and the realities of geopolitical and security challenges that necessitated re-engagement. Under the Trump administration, A declared policy of America First sought to prioritize domestic interests and reduce U.S. involvement in foreign conflicts, while simultaneously facing the persistent threats posed by Iran, Russia, ISIS, and other militant groups. This phase highlighted the tension between the U.S. desire to disengage and the strategic importance of maintaining a presence in the region to protect its interests, particularly with regard to counterterrorism, countering Iranian influence, and ensuring the stability of key allies such as Israel and Saudi Arabia. One of the most significant policy decisions during this period was the announcement by President Trump in December 2018 that the U.S. would withdraw its troops from Syria. This decision was driven by the notion that ISIS had been largely defeated and that the U.S. had achieved its primary objectives in the country. However, this move caused significant concern both domestically and internationally, as it risked abandoning the Kurdish forces who had been crucial allies in the fight against ISIS. The U.S. withdrawal also led to a shift in the balance of power in Syria, allowing for greater influence from Russia and Iran, both of whom had been backing Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The withdrawal was met with criticism from various quarters, including U.S. military officials, who argued that a rapid pullout could undo the progress made in the region and leave a power vacuum that would be exploited by Iran, ISIS, and even Turkey, which viewed Kurdish groups in Syria as an extension of the PKK, Kurdistan Workers' Party, a group labeled as a terrorist organization by Ankara. As U.S. troops withdrew from Syria, Turkey launched Operation Peace Spring in October 2019, a military offensive aimed at removing Kurdish forces from northern Syria, particularly along the Turkish-Syrian border. The U.S. decision to abandon the Kurds and allow Turkey to act unchallenged in this context left a bitter legacy. Kurdish forces, who had been instrumental in the defeat of ISIS, felt betrayed, and their trust in the U.S. was severely damaged. The fallout from the withdrawal also raised questions about U.S. commitment to its allies in the region and its long-term strategy in Syria. The chaos that followed the U.S. pullout contributed to a humanitarian crisis and further instability, as the Syrian government, supported by Russian and Iranian forces, gained ground on former U.S.-backed opposition groups. While President Trump's decision to withdraw from Syria was a defining moment in his Middle East policy, the U.S. also had to deal with its continued presence in Iraq. The Iraq War, which had begun in 2003, left a complicated legacy, and by 2017, the U.S. was still involved in counterterrorism operations in Iraq, primarily focused on preventing the resurgence of ISIS. The Iraqi government, while nominally an ally of the U.S., had increasing influence from Iran, which had backed militias and other proxy forces in the country. In January 2020, the U.S. found itself embroiled in a significant confrontation with Iran, which had been escalating tensions in the region. The U.S. assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad marked a dramatic shift in relations between the U.S. and Iran, leading to heightened fears of an all-out conflict. Soleimani's death was a pivotal moment in the broader U.S. Iran conflict, as it escalated already rising tensions over Iranian influence in Iraq and the broader region. Soleimani had been the commander of the Quds Force, a unit of Iran's Revolutionary Guard responsible for foreign operations, and he had been a key figure in Iran's strategies to assert its power in the Middle East. His killing by a U.S. drone strike in Baghdad was met with outrage in Iran and across the region. Iran retaliated with missile strikes on U.S. military bases in Iraq, though these attacks did not result in significant casualties. The U.S. assassination of Soleimani and the subsequent retaliation marked one of the most dangerous periods in U.S.-Iran relations in decades. While the U.S. was able to avoid a direct military confrontation, the assassination created an environment of heightened volatility and uncertainty in Iraq and the wider Middle East. President Trump also pursued a policy of isolating Iran, including the withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal, JCPOA, in 2018. The Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign against Iran included reimposing sanctions on the Iranian economy, targeting its oil exports, and pressuring international allies to align with U.S. policy. The strategy aimed to force Iran to renegotiate its nuclear program, but it also deepened regional instability, as Iran responded by supporting militias and proxy groups across the region, particularly in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon. Iran's support for these groups further complicated U.S. efforts to stabilize the region, as these proxy forces were involved in attacks against U.S. interests and allies. Despite the administration's efforts to reduce U.S. military presence in the region, the Trump administration also faced calls to re-engage militarily to confront growing threats. In particular, the U.S. military was called upon to protect its interests in the region from threats posed by Iran-backed militias, who frequently attacked U.S. assets in Iraq and other parts of the Middle East. The Trump administration also found itself caught in the broader geopolitical competition with China and Russia, both of which have been expanding their influence in the Middle East, particularly in Syria. As a result, the U.S. was forced to maintain a strategic presence to counter the growing influence of these adversaries. The Biden administration, which took office in January 2021, inherited a complex and highly charged Middle Eastern landscape. While Biden campaigned on a platform of reducing U.S. military entanglements, particularly in the Middle East, he faced the ongoing realities of U.S. commitments to its allies and the growing threat from non-state actors, such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda, and regional powers like Iran. The Biden administration initially promised to limit U.S. involvement in conflicts and focus on diplomacy and multilateral approaches, but it quickly realized that disengagement was not a feasible option in a region as volatile and strategically important as the Middle East. A key moment in the early Biden administration was the decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan, a policy that was in line with Trump's own agreement with the Taliban. However, the chaotic and violent nature of the withdrawal, culminating in the fall of Kabul to the Taliban in August 2021, cast a long shadow over U.S. foreign policy in the region. The abrupt collapse of the Afghan government and the resurgence of the Taliban raised serious questions about the effectiveness of the U.S. mission in the region and its long-term commitment to counterterrorism operations.